Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the second installment of Pastor Benny's Let's Talk About series. My name is Singyap and I'll be your host tonight. Many people, churches, and organizations have been tremendously blessed by Pastor Benny's ministry, but he just can't be everywhere. So he has set up Arrows Resources to be a channel to provide content and consultation. So Pastor Benny, can you share with us your heart and vision for Arrows Resources?
Sure, thank you. First of all, let me say thank you for honoring me with your time tonight. Over the last 20 or so years, I've been teaching the Word of God and have been planting Bible schools and Bible training centers on the mission field. And that is what we've been doing for the last 20 over years. And over the last 10 years, I've also started to help to build intentional disciple-making churches. And over these 2 decades or so of ministry, learned a few things, have created some content. And I've always sought to try and share the content with the wider body. And our plans now is to be able to put all of our content onto an online platform so that it can be made more accessible to the body of Christ. And my team over here have here in Faith Community Church in Perth, they also have the same passion to want to be able to be a blessing to other local churches. And that is why we are happy to kind of do this together and to see this as our contribution to the body of Christ. So this is what we are doing and something that we are really hoping to be able to do well. So thank you for your support. Thank you for your trust in our ministry.
Thank you so much, Pastor Benny, for your heart. So if you have been blessed by Pastor Benny's ministry and you want to sow financially into the work of Arrows Resources so that the ministry can reach wider and go further, you can do so electronically with the information coming up on your screen. And for people in Faith Community Church, you can also give online via fcc.live. Thank you so much for your support and generosity. Tonight, Pastor Benny will be talking about conflict management. When conflicts are managed well, individuals, families, connect groups, churches, organizations, companies, and even nations can become stronger and healthier. But when they are not managed well, the pains and the damages can last for a long time, a lifetime, and even for generations. And in this session tonight, Pastor Benny will be giving us important principles and practical keys to manage conflicts constructively towards a redemptive outcome. And he will also be answering your burning questions. So if you have questions on your mind, or as you listen, questions come to you, just feel free to type them in immediately into the Q&A section. And we will have a Q&A at the halfway mark and then another one right at the end. So right now, it is still not too late to share this webinar link with someone whom you think will really benefit from tonight's teaching. So over to you, Pastor Benny,
Thank you.
as you walk us through.
Thank you, Pastor Sigyap. Well, let me begin with this. Leslie Flynn, in his book Church Conflicts, has this humorous poem that I like a lot. And the poem goes like this: to dwell above with the saints we love, now that is grace and glory. But to live below with the saints we know, now that's another story. And I thought that was really funny. You know, and it's true that we all can be nice from far, but at times far from nice. And that is why I think conflicts can be very much a part and parcel of life. Now, let's try and look at this theologically for a start, okay? When did conflict begin? When did conflict begin? I think it started right from the beginning of human history. Because in Genesis chapter 3, we begin to see the development of a conflict situation. Now, what happened was, after Satan cast a doubt on God's character in Genesis chapter 3, verse 4, this is what happened. The serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And from that point on, Eve began to experience a tension inside of her. And that was, to me, the first conflict situation. And then she ended up making a decision that turned out to be wrong. She ate the fruit, and then she passed the fruit to Adam, and he ate it as well. And then the Bible tells us that God came down in the cool of the evening and confronted them for what they had done. And you notice that when God confronted them, the first thing that happened was a blame game began. And so what you found was Adam immediately blamed Eve, and then Eve blamed the devil, etc., etc. And that's when conflict really began. And ever since then, man has been living in conflicts after conflicts. And in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 6, the prophet Isaiah says, we all, and he's describing the human condition, and he says, we all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us have turned to his own way. Now I'd like you to notice this description carefully. Isaiah says, we all like sheep has gone astray, meaning that we have gone astray from God. But not only that, we did not just walk away from God, but we actually walk away from one another. Now listen again to Isaiah 53 verse 6. We all like sheep has gone astray. Each of us have turned to his own separate ways. See, when we fell into sin, not only have we gone astray from God, but we are also separated from one another. And that is the beginning of conflicts, right from the beginning of time. So when will conflict end? That's another good question. When will conflicts end? Since man fell in the Garden of Eden, we have lived in a state of broken relationship, firstly with God, and then also with one another. And I think this is the curse of humanity. And this curse will finally be removed in Revelations 21, Revelations 22. Because with the coming of a new kingdom, where there shall no longer be any curse, according to Revelations 22, verse 3. And then what will happen? That is when all tears will be wiped away. That's when a child can play in the den, with a den of snakes. That's when the lion and the lamb can lie down together. And I think that is when nations will stop warring against nations. But in the meantime, between now until the coming of that kingdom, in the meantime, there is going to be misunderstandings, there will be disagreements. And all these can result in conflicts, which can even at times lead to sin. However, it is important for us to remember, brothers and sisters, that conflict does not necessarily mean sin. Okay? Conflict in itself is not sin. Conflict is part and parcel of life. If we are in relationship, there can be conflicts. Now, and we all need to recognize and accept that conflict is a part of our humanity. Now, the crucial thing, I think, is to learn how to resolve conflicts well. We all must learn how to deal with differences openly and truthfully and quickly. And we watch over the attitudes and the behaviors of those that are in conflict so that it does not lead to sinful behavior. Now, I believe it's not a sin for Christians to be in conflict, but when we do not manage our conflict situations well, they can result in sinful behavior. And when we allow our conflicts to spill over into things like blame shifting or psychological and physical destruction or even deception, then it becomes sin. Our conflicts have led to sin. See, and whenever love is lost to hatred, gentleness to maliciousness, and truthfulness to deception, humility gives way to selfishness, then it becomes sinful. But hear me, facing conflict itself, experiencing conflict itself is not sin. In fact, I actually think that conflicts can be constructive because if we manage our conflict situation well, it can actually lead to good change in all the conflicting parties. I like to think of it this way. Whatever does not break us can actually bond us. See? So when did conflict begin? I think it started right from the creation. And when will it end? I think it will end when Jesus comes again. So in between, we need to ask ourselves a few questions, one of which is, what can cause conflicts? What are some potential areas of conflict? I'd like to list a few for our consideration. Number one is this. I think conflicts can happen when our territory is threatened. Okay, and I'll try to be as practical as I can throughout this whole session so that we can really deal with things that are real and things that you and I are facing. Number one, when territory is threatened. When our territory or private space is threatened, I think it can potentially give rise to conflicts. And we have all seen great conflicts that results from one's personal space being invaded by others. Okay, and I'd like to outline for you 4 kinds of territorial disputes that can happen, and I'm sure we have experienced it at one time or another. And here are 4 territorial disputes that can happen. Number one is psychological space. I think there's a space within every individual, and this has to do with our self-identity, our esteem, and our emotions. Now, personally, I have seen, how families, for example, that can host guests in their home until their guests overstay their welcome, and then it ends up in conflict situation. Why? Because personal space is involved. Okay, what about the second thing? Social standing. That's another territorial dispute. This refers to the status within a social unit, right? The identity or the level of acceptance that you and I have within different groupings. If someone is made to lose face, in other words, in a group that's important to him, if he's made to lose face before a group he identifies with, I think it breeds conflicts. And some of the deeper issues that can happen in this sphere of social standing would include like racial or gender or social identities. And all this can lead to conflicts. The third area will be personal possession. Personal possession. When something that you own, like wealth or belonging or status, is taken away, it is invaded or it is claimed by another party, I think conflicts can erupt. Conflicts can occur. And we have seen enough of such disputes, in the law courts of the world. And you know, and I know, in the law courts, even families, relatives, friends, strangers, they fight over things that they consider to have been taken away, violated by other people. Personal possession. And one more is organizational position. When your position in an organization or a setup is being taken over or usurped by another party, then conflicts can explode onto the scene. I think no human organizations are spared from these potential sources of conflict. And that includes the church. And that includes Christian organizations. Sometimes we have this very rosy idea that as long as we are in the church, as long as we are among Christians, none of these things will happen. But you and I know that's not true. Okay, and number one, when territory is threatened, it's a potential source of conflict. Number two, when expectations are not met. I think this is one potential area of conflict that the Asian culture, those of us who come from the Asian culture, is particularly susceptible to. Because, as Asians, we highly esteem diplomacy. And we sometimes think that it is culturally impolite, to be upfront with our expectation. And the problem lies right here. The closer we are, the higher is the level of our unspoken expectation. And that is when the greatest source of conflict can happen. And that is the reason why, have you ever noticed that some of the worst conflicts happen between people that are closest to us? And that's where the potential for conflict sometimes goes even higher. And we must do everything we can to avoid any unrealistic, unclear, or unmet expectation in our relationship. Number three, when we go through change, when people go through transition, there is a higher chance of conflicts happening because people are by nature resistant to change. Yet change is the most constant thing in life. And please bear this in mind. When change is imminent, the number one question on everybody's mind is always this: how does this change affect me? Everybody is asking the same question. How does this change affect me? And please remember that there are always 3 groups of people whenever we go through a change situation. And basically they are those who will lose out, number 1. 2, those who are neutral. And then the third group is those who stand to gain. Every time a change takes place, in a social grouping, in an organization, or even in the church. There are those who lose out, those who are neutral, and those who stand to gain. And each group is different, and we need to deal with them with sensitivity, but also at the same time with integrity. And please remember this, the group that will react and retaliate the most will be the group that stand to lose out. So pay special attention to this group, those who stand to lose out because of the change. Okay, number 4, when leadership is unclear, the lack of leadership clarity, I think, is a common cause of conflict. Conflicts will arise when there are unclear structures, when we have undefined job specification, when we have communication gaps, when we have poor planning and processes, when we have dysfunctional leadership. All this is where leadership is unclear, and therefore it creates a seedbed for conflicts to happen. And I think if you are a leader at home or in your organization or in your church, pay special attention to this. I've learned over the years, out of my own pain, for being unclear, I really end up reaping a whole lot of conflicts. And this is something we all need to deal with. And as a result of all that I've gone through, I came up with this very important principle that I think is good for all leaders to know, which is this. I think clarity is the currency that leadership transacts with. And we transact, as leaders, we transact in clarity. That's the currency we transact with. And if we are not clear, I think we are setting things up for conflicts. So watch this. Number 5, when personalities clash. Now this is one of the most common causes of conflict in normal relationship. I think God has wired all of us differently. We all have unique combinations of gifts, abilities, and personality types. And some personality makes just get on each other's nerve. If you are one of those that are very people-oriented, then the chances of having a conflict with someone that is very task-oriented it just escalates, because of personality clashes. And the only way to deal with this is to understand and to accept each other. We learn to appreciate the strengths of the other party and to complement and to allow them to complement our weaknesses when personalities clash. Number 5, a very important one, when values collide. All of us are value-driven, whether we realize it or not. And when our values clash, that is where potential conflicts can arise. And this is particularly true when there is a generational or cultural gap. So values tend to clash. Number 6, when methodologies differ. Now, very often, conflicts arise over differences in methodologies. Not just vision, not just ideas, but even in methodologies. And that has to do with the way that something ought to be done. And we all have different opinions about it. Should we fry it or should we steam it? Is it cash or is it credit? Is it now or later? Should Gentiles be circumcised? Should apostles serve tables? All these are issues that happen in the Bible. See, and these are all, they're here. So these are the 6 things that I think we need to pay attention to that can give rise to potential conflicts. Okay, and before we ask some questions, I want to just outline for you now a very important skill, something that we need to know in order to handle conflicts well. Now, I've learned over time that I've observed that there are conflicts tend to follow a 5-stage progression. That means as a conflict begins to develop and escalate, there are 5 stages that the conflict will go through. Now, even though the conflict can come from different sources, but they seems to go through the same progress, okay? And we will call it a conflict cycle. Now, here's the principle. The duration of each stage in the cycle may vary from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4. They can vary from a few minutes. In some very heated situation, it can escalate very quickly. Within minutes, it can happen. Or it can go for days, months, or even years. But no matter what the duration may be, I think the conflict stages are linear in nature. That means one stage will lead to the other. One stage will lead to the other. And the other principle to remember is this. A conflict can be handled at any of the stages. You can begin to manage that conflict at stage 1 or stage 2 or stage 3 or even at stage 5. But if we delay managing the conflict at the first stage, it will escalate to the next. See, and the wisest thing to do in conflict management is to learn to manage the conflict at the early stages rather than to let it escalate all the way to the last stage. So here's an illustration that I like to show you on your slides now. You will see there are 5 stages, okay? And I'm going to run you through each of those stages one at a time so that you can recognize it. And when you are able to recognize it, I believe you'll be able to know that you need to jump in. You need to be able to deal with that conflict, okay? So let's try to outline what each stage looks like. So let's begin with stage 1. Stage 1 is what we call tension development stage. Now, all conflicts begin as a mere tension in the relationship. That's all. Okay, it's just a tension. There is no fight yet. It's just a simple sense of tension. And this tension is important because the moment you recognize that there's a tension inside, it signals that someone is experiencing a sense of the loss of freedom within that relationship. Okay, say for example, you are in a family gathering and someone just said something that maybe offended you in some way. You're not sure if the person is trying to offend you, but you just felt that statement made is not called for. And then you begin to experience something inside. That is a tension development stage. You begin to feel a sense of a loss of freedom, and within that relationship. And this sense of the loss of freedom set the stage up for a conflict situation. Now, hear me on this. Resolution of the conflict is handled most effectively at this stage. Because at stage 1, there is little or no harm that has happened. It's just a careless thing said or something like that. There is no harm that has occurred to either party. Now, unfortunately, what often happens is that this is not when people actually see it as a conflict and deal with it, because the parties at this point are hesitant to mention the presence of this tension, because the issue at this point looks a bit insignificant. And none of us want to be seen to be small-minded, so we rather just keep it, and we just let the tension be there. Now, this is a stage of the conflict development where we had a tendency to sweep things under the carpet, and then we pretend that nothing is wrong. Somebody did something, somebody said something. You think that that's not quite right, but you tend to, never mind, sweep it under the carpet. And then, here's where the problem, we hope that it will just go away. We hope that it will not happen again, or we pretend that nothing is wrong. But if the conflict is not openly admitted and nipped at the bud at this point, after a while, that conflict, some confusion will begin to set in. Let's say, for example, something that person did offended you, but you just ignore it because it's only stage 1 and you don't want to come across as small-minded. But the next day, it happened again. This is where it can escalate now. Because that conflict is not openly admitted, not nipped to the bud. After a while, confusion begins to set in because the parties now no longer feel that they are free to depend on each other to do what is expected. On top of that, they are not even sure how they should personally act under this new situation. Then the conflict begins to escalate to the next stage. Okay, so stage 1 is tension development stage, just a little feeling, that's all. Then, because you don't deal with it, it goes to stage 2. Now you have a role confusion stage. Okay, this is where harmony and productivity that you often have as a team now gives rise to a confusion of roles. This begins to consume the conflicting parties' time and energies now, because this thing is escalating. And this is the stage, in stage 2, questions begin to be asked within ourselves. Like, for example, so what's happening between me and this person? Did I do anything to cause this tension? We ask questions of why is he or she doing this? What did I do to deserve this? Who's in charge here? And we begin to ask questions like, should I do anything about this? And as it goes even further and further, we begin to ask questions like, why should I take all this nonsense? Should I just give it to him? And these are all the confusion and questions that are starting to come up. And listen to me, brothers and sisters, this is the point. Now, as never before, the parties should be talking to each other. They should be finding time to sit down and define the points of tension. What is this feeling that we are getting? Why is this uneasiness happening between us? And they should be identifying the cause of the conflict so that they can then renegotiate new commitments before the problem escalates. But ironically, there are very few conflicting parties that will be open to share or discuss the problem at this stage. And I'll tell you why. At stage 1, at tension development stage, we are too embarrassed to bring up the situation because it seems too insignificant and nobody wanted to be seen as small-minded. But at role confusion stage, stage 2, the issue has now become a lot more threatening. So they choose to avoid it. They would rather, and this is where it gets dangerous. It is at this point that they rather talk to other people than to talk to the other party directly. And communication now between the conflicting parties has started to break down. And they could be actively beginning to blame each other on the inside. And this opens the door to the next stage, which is stage 3. And I call it injustice gathering stage. Now listen carefully. This is the first danger stage because this is a stage where things can become sin-prone. The possibility of getting into sinful behavior begins here because now the parties are convinced that matters can only get worse. See? And so they begin to pull apart and they are each now preparing for the battle which they are certain will come sooner or later. And it is at this point that conflicting parties tend to begin to collect injustice. They start to notice what the other party is doing that is wrong, and we start to keep a record of it. And that's where love is out of the window because the Bible tells us that love keeps no records of wrong. And it is at this point people start to keep a record of all the injustice, all the wrong action, all the hurts, and all these can later be used as ammunition to justify their own sense of being violated. And to give greater justification and as a way of venting their emotions. This is the point where the parties are tempted to talk to as many people as possible. And this, of course, gives rise to rumors, it gives rise to wrong information and vicarious anger, something I'll talk to you a bit more later on. Now, injustice gathering at this stage generates a lot of negative energy that distracts the party from focusing on the real issue at hand. And they are more concerned about fixing the blame now on the other party than they are at fixing the problem. And very soon, we are looking for reasons to pull apart and reasons to put distance between ourselves. And worse still, those who are seen to be on the other side can now also be seen to be in conflict with us. And all this happened primarily because at this stage, the parties are no longer focusing on the problem, but we are focusing on the other party, which is now seen as the adversary. That's the problem person. And the other party is now seen to be the problem. And at this point, reason is giving way to anger. And can I suggest that if you know that you are in a conflict situation and it has reached stage 3, injustice gathering stage, then I think mediation is a must. Usually by the time we reach this stage, the parties can no longer talk objectively with one another. We would probably need mediation at this point. If we don't get mediation at this point, it can escalate to stage 4, which is what I would call a confrontation stage. This is the inevitable contact moment where the fight must take place, where the battle lines are being drawn. It's an inevitable stage that will take place after all the injustice gathering has happened and gone on for some time. And when they confront, this confrontation can range from clearing the air to outright violence. And here's the thing, in unmanaged conflict situation, when people confront one another, it can lead to a lot of pain. Now, in well-managed conflict situation, if there's good mediation that takes place, we can still sit the parties down and confront the issues that cause the tension in the first place. But conflicts that are unmanaged or poorly managed is potentially very, very damaging. However, it can also give rise to resolution. Okay, and the parties will, if it is well managed, it can give rise to a good outcome, but if it is not well managed, it will lead to a disastrous outcome. But in all circumstances, it can be an uncomfortable affair because all parties may now begin to feel that there's no other option but to confront. But when you do confront, and if good mediation is involved, I think it can lead still to a good outcome. Okay, and let's say mediation happened. Okay, and and depending on whether it is well managed or not well managed, it will still lead to stage 5, which is adjustment stage. Okay, and this is the final stage where they have to go through some adjustment. And this is the point where the parties adjust, right, to whatever changes they made to end the confrontation. Okay, so in cases where it is well managed, in cases where the mediation was well done and it was well managed, then the adjustment can take the form of renegotiated expectation. That means they renegotiate expectation. They now end up with a greater respect for each other, a greater understanding towards each other, and to have to see new perspective through all of that. And then the outcome ideally can actually be new and deeper commitments to the relationship. Because remember, if that conflict don't break us, it can actually bond us. So that is if it is a good outcome. But assuming that it's not well managed, or if there's no mediation at all, and there's just this huge fight and this huge confrontation, then the adjustment can take the form of avoidance. In other words, after that, we just avoid each other. Or even a severance of relationship. That means we just cut ties with each other. Or you end up with one party dominating the other, or both parties going into a cold war. Now that will be a really undesired outcome. And that's due to poor mediation or no mediation at all. But my prayer is that as we learn this and we learn about this conflict cycle and we begin to recognize the different stages and we will all aim to resolve conflict at the early stages, stage 1, at worst stage 2, and don't even allow it to go into stage 3 and beyond. I think we will actually allow our organizations, our families to have a good conflict management culture by addressing things quickly, honestly, authentically at stage 1 or 2. But if it ever need to go beyond, then let's seek good mediation so that we can learn how to manage with the goal that we will come out at the other end deeper and stronger than when we went into it. So that's the aim.
Pastor, thank you very much.
Yeah.
That has really been very clear and really giving us a lot of handles.
Okay, I hope that's the case.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about, conflict arising from values collision. One of the points you said just now about potential causes.
Yeah, values collide.
Yeah. And so I'm just thinking, take for example, a person who values structure versus a person who values spontaneity. Okay. And we see how this plays out in many ways. Yeah. When families go on holidays, in work culture, in work teams, leadership teams, how do you resolve a conflict arising from values collision? Because the values that are important to me, they are right for me, but they may not be right for you. But I also can't say that you are wrong. So so when conflict arises, how do you resolve that?
This is very real to me. Even between my wife and I, we are very different. We value different things. My wife values details, accuracy, and all of that. But I'm more a big picture person. So this is very real. And I've actually found that when it comes to mediating conflict situations, when it involves values that clash is really one of the hardest things to manage. It really is. But I learned over the years that perhaps there are a few things that are very, very necessary when it comes to negotiating value differences. The first is this, that the first thing I think is wisdom. We need wisdom to manage value differences, because someone defined wisdom as this. Wisdom is the ability to balance the demands in any given situation, because in any given situation there's lots of demands, and wisdom is the ability to balance all the demands in the fear of the Lord. That would be godly wisdom. And I find that if we are able to have that wisdom to see the big picture, then we learn to appreciate the strength of the other party's wiring. Because every value comes with strengths as well. So I must be able to see that, and the ability to balance that demand. Like, I could be a structured person, but someone who is spontaneous has certain strengths that I don't have. I must really, really learn to appreciate that. If not, I will always think that we cannot find even ground. I may be systematic, but another person can be very innovative. So if I can recognize that, have the wisdom to see all that, I think it will really help me a lot. So one of the things is wisdom, to be able to see the big picture, appreciate the strength of others. The second is humility, to know our place. Why I say that is because in any given situation, there is always, in most at least, there's always a understanding that there is one party that needs to make the call. So if I know my role, say between my wife and me, my wife knows that in the end, I as the head of the house need to make a decision on something. And so even if our values may not be the same, we hear each other out, but in the end, I must allow the leader to lead according to the way that God has wired him, that lead in line with his own value system. So I think having that humility, if I know that I'm not the one who's supposed to make the call, I must share my views, but in the end, learn to submit to the person that need to make the call. And I always remind myself that the real test of submission is not when we submit to what we like, but the real test of submission is when we have to submit to what we don't like. And I think that is the real test of submission, the real test of humility. So number one, wisdom, to be able to appreciate the other side. Two, humility, to know my place, so that I know whether am I supposed to make the call or am I allowing my leader to make the call. And the third, which is also very important, Gab, is this. I think it's the grace. At the end of the day, the grace to let others be. Because there will be situations where we are peers, and you have as much right to make a decision as I do. But and when we really come to a head now, and we really cannot find a resolution, one party is going to have to find a grace to let others be. This one thing I learned from first the Apostle Paul, and if I can just quickly show you, read a verse for you that I found very, very helpful in this regard. The Apostle Paul in the book of Philippians chapter 3, verse 15, has this great verse that goes like this. Paul said, all of us then, Philippians 3:15, who are mature should take such a view of things. But if on some point you think differently, then that too God will make clear to you. Only let us live up to what we have already attained. I think the Apostle Paul is being very practical here. What he's saying is that oftentimes in situations, by right, those of us who are mature should take such a view of things. But there are others who may not think the same way, who may not have the same maturity level. And Paul actually says that if on some point you think differently, that too God will make clear to you. Only let us live up to what we have already attained. So according to the level of our maturity, we ought to make decisions a certain way. But there are others who don't. And when that is the case, I think there's a place where we also find the grace to let others be. There's a book that I found very helpful, a book written by Chuck Swindoll years and years ago, entitled Whatever Happened to Grace, I think. And in his book, there was one chapter which he wrote entitled The Grace Let Others Be. I thought that chapter is worth the price of the book, because it is a chapter that teaches us, there are times when we need to almost like submit to other people's immaturity and find the grace to that's, even though we differ, we must find the grace to let others be, because that's where they are now in their walk with God, in their relationship with God. And then from there, we end up not churning inside. Then from there, we are able to work and journey together, rather than to always be in conflict.
Thank you, Pastor.
I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Pastor. Wisdom, humility, and grace.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pastor, for providing us such a helpful structure spontaneously.
This evening, what I'd like to share with you is something more critical, because how do we as Christians deal with such conflict situation? And how do we make use of this knowledge of conflict development and where conflict can erupt? And then we apply it into our Christian context. And I think that's something will be very, very helpful. Now, as a springboard from an idea that my mentor, Reverend Edmund Chan, has, he has a thinking framework which is called SPO, Spiritual Personal Organizational, that I have applied to conflict management, and I found that it really, really helps me. I think it's one of the best models in which we can view the dynamic interplay between the three dimensions of the organizational, the personal, and the spiritual realm. Now, let me kind of draw that picture on the chart for you. It will help you to see how this actually works. Now, here's what we're talking about. From a Christian perspective, how do we deal with conflicts? Now, most conflicts, whether you're Christian, non-Christian, it always begins at the organizational level. So that's the first level, the organizational level. Why do conflicts begin? It's usually because we have some principles that are not correct, and therefore it gives rise to a conflict situation. Other times it's because it could be a protocol that we don't abide by, and as a result, somebody feels violated, and that can give rise to a conflict. Other times it could be it's just the perimeters are wrong, or it could be that our practices is not good. We're not exercising best practice, and as a result, it can give rise to conflict. And then other times it's because our processes are not clear, and people then violate those processes, and as a result, a conflict situation arises. Now, even though most conflicts begin just organizationally, the problem is that it does not stay there. Now, at this stage, if it's just stage 1 and stage 2 in the conflict development, we can have quick conversation, robust discussion, and we are able to resolve it at that level. Fantastic. But if we don't, then it can escalate to the next level. The next level is when it becomes personal. Have you ever noticed this, that there are conflict situations that arise, and because they are not dealt with at stage 1, stage 2, they are not discussed, they are not really robustly talked over, and in the end, after a while, what it ends up with is that it becomes personal between the conflicting parties. And after a while, sometimes people can't even remember what started the conflict in the first place. The only thing they end up with is, I don't like this person. I just don't like his face. And then whatever that person do, you just consider it not good enough. There's something wrong with it. And that's when it becomes personal. And now we go, it's reaching stage 3, stage 4, where it escalated into something very personal. It's almost like this. It's like a house that you have, and when there is a crack in the wall, then what happens? The devil comes in, the snake will come in. And the moment the snake comes in, and because there's a fracture already in the relationship, then what happens is the devil has a foothold in that relationship now. And then it escalates to the next level, and that's when the problem becomes spiritual. It's no longer just organizational. It's no longer just personal. I just know I don't like this person, that person don't like me, and there are things that are happening there. The relationship is fractured. Now it becomes a spiritual problem. Why? Because that's where the snake comes in. The devil takes advantage of that broken relationship. And then the next thing you know, a cloud begin to come, a dark cloud comes over the organization, comes over the church, it comes over the home. And this is the point where rebellion can come in. This is the point where sin becomes present. This is the point where anger comes in, resentment comes in. This is the point where unforgiveness can come in. This is the point where deception comes into the picture. And all of a sudden, there's a dark cloud that comes over the organization. It comes over the church, comes over the home. And then we wonder why. There seems to be a heaviness in this whole thing. It's because sin has come in and the devil is having a heyday in where we are. I don't know if this makes sense to you, but how it develops is organizational, then it escalates to personal, and then it becomes a spiritual problem. Now, here's the thing. Our problems may begin from the bottom up. It starts organizational, becomes spiritual, becomes personal, becomes spiritual. OPS, oops. But here's the key. The key is that when we seek to deal with this conflict, we've got to go top down. In other words, we've got to think spiritual, then personal, then organizational. So what do I mean by this? What it means is this. If I have a conflict situation between two parties and they are both believers, I think we can really apply this. Okay? And where we need to do is that when we try to resolve the conflict, we need to start with the spiritual. And at the spiritual level, we need to ask ourselves two questions. Two very important questions. Number one, what is Satan's scheme in all of this? What is Satan's scheme? I think his scheme is always the same. He has been using the same technique against us right from the beginning of time. John 10:10 says this, the devil came to steal, to kill, and to destroy. He came to steal our joy. He came to destroy our relationship. That's what the devil wants to do. And he wants to steal, to kill, and to destroy. But what is God's agenda? There's a second question we need to ask. What is God's agenda? I believe God's agenda is us. God's agenda is to grow us. That through all of this, we will be discipled. That through all of this, God will transform us if we respond to it correctly. What is Satan's scheme? Is to steal, to kill, to destroy. What is God's agenda? God's agenda is to grow us. Now, if we understand this, then we are going to view this conflict from a completely different perspective. Okay? Now, if we understand that God's agenda is to grow us, now this is where we then need to ask ourselves, now, we know that Satan's scheme is to steal, to kill, and to destroy. And he's having a heyday with all these things in our organization, in our church, in our cell group, whatever it may be. Then what do? Of course, we all know we have authority to bind all these forces of darkness and all these things that are going on. We can put a stop to this. We can arrest this. But the thing is this, we don't have spiritual authority to deal with these things until we resolve our fracture. We need to be able to seal up this crack. Then we get the snake out, seal up this crack, and then we can be restored. See, and the thing is this, we need to deal with the personal. We've got to come back here and resolve our relational fracture. And that will give us the right to deal with the powers of darkness. If not, the devil has got a legal foothold in this situation. See, and he can bring us down as a result. So, how do we deal with the personal then? And this is where if we understand that Satan's scheme is to steal, to kill, to destroy, but God's agenda is to grow us, then we need to ask ourselves a few key questions. Like, for example, what part have I contributed to this conflict? It's a good question to ask. In what way have I contributed to this conflict situation? Is there something that God is putting His finger on? Is there some area in my life that God is putting His finger on? Is there some way that I need to change? Is there something I need to put right? What responsibility do I have to play? How did I contribute to this? And if we can answer this question, what is some areas that God is wanting me to change? Is there something I need to forgive? Or is there something I need to seek forgiveness for in this whole conflict situation? And we need to ask ourselves some really good key questions. And if both parties were to ask those questions of themselves, by the time we come to the table to mediate, by the time we come to the table to resolve the conflict, we will not be going there trying to fix blame, but we'll be going there ready to take responsibility as well. See, and the mediator's job is then to be able to allow everybody to really express the feelings that is going on in their hearts, the hurts that they have, but to do it from the perspective that I'm also ready to take responsibility. I'm not here to fix blame. And when we are able to come to that table prepared and ready with all this, I believe that there is great potential for reconciliation. And once we can resolve the relational fracture between the parties involved, then I think we have authority. The legal right is being removed, and we have authority now to bind the forces of darkness and to stop all these things that is going on. Okay, and that's where we find truly real resolution and real reconciliation. But here's the thing. After we have dealt with this spiritually, and we have dealt with it personally, and we can get rid of that snake now, and we can seal up this crack. But here's the thing. We still need to go back and deal with the organizational, because after we have resolved the personal and the spiritual, we must come back to the organizational and put right the principles, make sure that the protocols are clear, the parameters are clear, that our practices are right, and we want to make sure that our processes are being followed. Because if we don't deal with the organizational, then I think it is a conflict, a potential conflict waiting to happen again. It's an accident waiting to happen. See, and people have done this. They have resolved it spiritually, personally, but they never dealt with the organizational. And then it was a conflict just waiting to happen again. And the next thing you know, another one will erupt. And the more conflicts we have for the same thing, the harder it is to find reconciliation. So, but good conflict resolution requires that we deal with all three: the spiritual, the personal, and the organizational. Now, I trust that this model I found to be so helpful. And before I would, if there are two conflicting parties and both are believers, I normally would go to each one of them privately first and share with them the concept and see if they would understand this and to be able to apply it first. And I actually would ask them to go through all those questions and write it down so that by the time they come to the table, they are ready. And if any one of the parties are not ready yet, I would not be too quick to bring them to the table unless it is an urgent matter. But if it's something that can be resolved over time, then, and especially when it is deep, I think I would rather take the time to make sure that we are all coming to this table with the same perspective. And then from there, I found that oftentimes reconciliation is entirely possible. So this SPO model I found to be very, very helpful. So I would really like us to process this and to think through it and how that actually works. And just for your reference, at this point, when the dark cloud comes over, sometimes apart from rebellion and anger and all that, other people can get sucked into the story as well. And this is where sometimes something which we call vicarious anger can happen. It's not just anger between the two parties, it can be every other people that they associate with. And this is where vicarious anger need to be understood. If I could just very quickly run you through what I mean by vicarious anger. Now, typically what happens is this. Say A has a conflict with B. Okay, so now there's a line of anger between A and B. Okay, so A is angry with B, B is upset with A. And then what happened invariably is that B, because he needed to unload this, he tells it to somebody, maybe C. And when C, who is B's best friend, heard what A did to B from B, then C begins to feel, how can A do that? That's so bad. Now I am also angry with A. Now let me ask you, is C involved in this conflict? Absolutely not. But why is C angry with A? Very simple. C is angry with A on behalf of B. Okay, and this is what we call vicarious anger. It means anger on behalf of someone else, even though you are not involved. You are angry with somebody else on behalf of your friend. And often what happened is somewhere along the way, A and B finally had a chance to meet, and then they talk it out, and then they realize it was a misunderstanding. And so this line of anger is being cancelled between A and B. So now A thinks that, well, my problem is resolved with B, everything should be okay, so now I should have an open heaven. If I lay hands on the sick, they shall recover. The sound of my voice, demons will tremble, because now I have an open heaven. I got no more conflict situation. But little did A know that actually there was somebody else who is angry with him, and that's C. And he doesn't even know. And can you imagine if B did not just tell C, but B also told D, and then D went to tell E, and then C went to tell F, and all these people are also angry with A. And A is totally bound up, with so much anger towards him that he doesn't even know. And usually A is the pastor, you understand? And he is bound up and is wondering why there's no breakthrough in his ministry. And it's because there are so many people angry with him that nobody knows about, that he doesn't even know about. And these are called vicarious anger. And my challenge to all of us, whether you're from here in FCC or you're watching online from elsewhere, watch out for this scheme of the devil. He has used it against us for donkey years, and we are still caught in it right up to now because we're not conscious of all these things that are happening. I tell people that if you are B and you went to tell C and D and E and F, when this conflict is resolved, it is your responsibility to go and cancel out all these other lines of anger on behalf of A. Imagine if you tell 100 people, you'll be very busy going around cancelling lines of anger, isn't it? So the best thing to do is don't talk too much. Talk to the relevant people where we can resolve situation. So this is a critical concept that I hope we all will pay attention to. And the devil has used it against the church for a long, long time. And we keep falling into this trap. And may the Lord help us in this. Okay? And before I move into our question and answer, can I just very quickly run you through what I consider to be common mistakes that we make in conflict resolution? Here are common mistakes that we make in conflict resolution. Number one is this: when we avoid engagement for too long. When we don't want to deal with the conflict situation when it's at stage 1 and stage 2, and then we allow it to go on for too long. And then the conflict cycle escalates beyond 1 and 2, and it goes into 3 and 4. And the longer that conflict development goes, the more entrenched both parties become in their position, and it becomes harder to mediate. And I think we should bear that in mind. And the principle I want to leave with you is this: it is never too early to manage the conflict, and it's never too late also to engage. So whatever stage we are in, if there's a conflict situation that needs mediation, then please, even if it's late, we must still engage. It's never too early to manage it, and never too late to engage. Prevention is better than cure. So to conflict-proof our organization and our homes, I think it's good to implement good conflict management culture. And here's a leadership principle I learned. If you want to be a leader, if you are a leader, whether at home or in your workplace or in our churches, if you want to be a leader, you cannot be everybody's friend. I think we have learned over time. There are times when the leader needs to do what a leader needs to do. And if you are a leader at home, in your organization or in your church, do your job. And if we need to engage, we need to engage. Okay, here's number 2. When we engage without knowing the facts. Okay, when we engage without knowing the facts. The first is when we wait too long. The second is when we rush in too quickly and we have not figured out the facts. One common mistake I find we make in conflict management is that we are too binary in our thinking. Now, what I mean is this. The moment we come to know of a situation, we immediately decide in our head, that one party is wrong, the other party is right. The moment we hear from someone, that's a situation that happened, we already decided A is right, B is wrong. Before we actually take time to listen to all the parties involved. And when I say listen, what I mean to say is not listening to problem solve, but listening to understand. Because as leaders, we also often make this mistake that we listen only to problem solve, and then we are too quick to give solution. But what I'm saying here is listening to understand what actually happened. We tend to listen just to provide quick solution. So what I'm literally saying is we learn to think gray. We learn to never make a judgment call until we hear all sides of the story. So never act on hearsay, never act on rumors, because when we do that as leaders, we can literally escalate the problem rather than to resolve it. I cannot recall how many times I make the mistake of jumping to conclusions too early. And as a result, I live to regret it. So I think we need to take time to know the facts before we jump in to provide solution. Here's number 3. The third common mistake, when we are too confrontational without cause. When we are too emotional already, if you are a conflicted party and you are too emotional, we tend to confront unnecessarily. So I think we need to watch so that we know when to confront and when not to confront. But in conflict management, we always start with clarification. We listen to clarify. We converse in order to clarify, not just to confront. Okay. Number 4, when we are too defensive. I think conflicts often escalate when the parties are out to defend their position rather than to address the other party's concern. We can be too keen to criticize rather than to reflect. And we can be there actually to find fault without realizing it, rather than to admit wrong, and the conflict escalate as a result. When the conflicting parties did not come with the intention to take responsibility, but rather to place blame, I think the conflict will escalate. And that is why that model of SPO is so important, because it begins with the premise that I'm here also to take responsibility, not just to get my rights heard. Okay, and here's number 5. By the way, Stephen Covey has a great saying that goes like this: seek first to understand, then to be understood. That's why we listen, not to be defensive, but we listen to understand. So we seek first to understand, then to be understood. Number 5, very important one, when we are not communicating to clarify. When we're not communicating to clarify. I think some conflicts don't get resolved simply because we are stonewalling one another. And by that I mean we are refusing to talk or to listen. Young people will say, ghost them, avoid them, and rather than to actually communicating, rather than connecting to clarify. The Cold War approach kills communication and will ultimately result in more fractures in our relationship. Okay, and here's number 6. Common mistake again, when we generalize or overgeneralize without being specific. I think conflicts really blow up and explode, when we overgeneralize and we use terms like you always, or you are forever, or you never. And terms like this are very all-encompassing. And words like this are overgeneralizing, and often it does not help in resolving the conflict. In fact, I think words matter. So please, in conflict resolution, we need to watch our words and watch what we are saying. Okay. Number 7, lastly, I think sometimes conflicts escalates because we do not understand different conflict management styles. Different people tend to approach conflicts differently. And in fact, studies have actually shown that it is quite in line with their personality. And knowing what the other party is like, especially if you are the conflicted party or you are the mediator, it's always good to know what the parties' conflict resolution styles are like, so that you can know what you're dealing with, and then you can tease out, the necessary from each one of them, because you know how to manage them and to manage their conflict resolution style. And 5 of the most common styles used are basically, I'll just outline them quickly for you. The different styles are basically, number 1, the tortoise approach. Now, the tortoise always avoid. So there are people who, when it's a conflict situation, they just want to avoid. They just go into their shell and they refuse to talk. And that's where the mediator needs to bring that out of them, to get them to share what is really going on in their hearts. If you understand the tortoise, you know what you need to do, because the tortoise avoids. Then we have the shark. The shark dominates. If you happen to be having to deal with the shark, then you need to be able to manage their response, because they will dominate the situation. The teddy bear will tolerate, and this is the guy who would, in the end, try to go for a compromise. Just you give some, I give some, and then we meet somewhere in the middle. That's the typical teddy bear's approach, to tolerate. However, that's not always the best approach also, because sometimes we just end up with the lowest common denominator, because all we do is to seek to compromise. I think there are situations where you cannot compromise. And then we have the fox. The fox compromises. The fox is the one who will compromise. Okay? But the teddy bear will always tolerate and give way. And he gives way and he gives way. And finally, we have the owl. The owl is the one that will collaborate and try to listen to everyone and then come up with a solution that perhaps will help everybody to move along. And I think of all, between the tortoise that avoid, the shark that dominates, the teddy bear that tolerates, the fox that compromises, the owl is probably the one that we would shoot for, where the collaborative approach to conflict management. So those are a few things that I want to outline for you, and then I'll be happy to take some of your questions as we go from here. Okay.
Thank you, Pastor Benny. I think you have provided us with really important principles, and not just that, some really practical handles for us to use. So I think we are all anticipating the Q&A time. But before we do that, again, just to let you know that if you want to support Pastor Benny's ministry and to just see what he does go further and wider, you can do that. Give electronically to Arrow's Resources with the information on your screen right now. And if you are attending Faith Community Church, you can also give via fcc.live. So right now, we're just going to dive right into our Q&A. And I will just post the first question. And a lot of us come from churches that really emphasize on connect groups or live groups or small groups. So this first question, I think, is really good. Okay, I'm just going to click and hopefully I can get the question to your screen. I'll just read that for you. What is the best approach to resolve conflict with your spiritual leader, for example, your CG leader? And do you go to the church pastor? I think that's a really good question. Yeah.
Well, now if you're asking this question in the context of a connect group, I like to believe that within a CG context, there should be enough relational fuel, if you like, for us to have a robust conversation, or for you to have a robust conversation with your connect group leader. So if you are in conflict with a connect group leader, within a CG context, there should be enough, relational fuel for you to have a direct conversation with your CG leader. And assuming that you are still in the first 2 stages of the conflict resolution cycle, I think this is the best time to actually call for a conversation. And if you do have that conversation, I would encourage you to go with the spirit to clarify first, rather than to just go in fighting or confronting. I think you'll be surprised if you go in with the spirit of wanting to clarify how easily the matter can be resolved. But however, if you are already past stage 1 and 2, and you're already in stage 3 where there are already some level of injustice gathering going on already, then I would perhaps suggest to you that you also may want to bring along another trusted cell member who could actually sit in and who could help mediate. Now, if that is not possible, let's say the situation is one where you can't bring another cell member along, then I think that you can apply the cell group church principle, which is this: whenever you are stuck in a situation where it is beyond you, you refer upwards.
Oh, okay.
So this is where I think there is room for you to be, if you feel that you have gone past stage 1 and 2 and you need mediation, it may be okay to refer upwards and bring in a zone supervisor to help mediate a good, robust conversation. But I do hope that there is enough in the relational bank account in a cell group to have some honest, authentic conversation directly with one another, whether you're a member or a Connect group leader. But the worst thing to do will be to avoid the critical conversation. And then we allow that conflict situation to develop further, and it could go into stage 4 and beyond. And then I think that will be too late. So it'd be good to deal with it as soon as possible.
A related question is, are we being out of God's alignment when we leave a church or a small group due to unresolved conflict situations?
Okay.
Or maybe not unresolved, but in the middle of conflict resolution, and you just find it tough and you want to leave. Is it? Can we do it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I won't say categorically that you are out of alignment with God simply because this can also be very situational. So until and unless I know what the situation is like, I cannot say categorically that if you leave, then you are definitely out of alignment with God. But I would say that it is never ideal to leave a church or a small group with unresolved conflict situation, simply because we are family. We are more than just a club or an organization, but we are actually an organism. We are family as a church. And I think it will please the Father if we learn to resolve conflicts biblically. And now I understand that some situations can be very, very complex and there are no easy answers to some of this situation. But I think it is often through conflicts that we actually grow our discipleship. And if we know how to deal with it correctly, I think we will grow as a result. And one of the principles I've learned is this, it is always best to find healing where you are hurt. Because I've seen so many situations where people are hurt and they have conflict situation, they don't resolve it, and then they just leave. And when they leave, they just carry the hurt somewhere else. And I think we should always seek to bring closure to those conflict situations whenever possible. And even if we do need to leave at the end of the day, we want to leave with accountability to the leaders that has come and they are watching over us. They need to watch over us. They watch over our soul. I like a verse in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 17, that actually goes like this. In Hebrews 12:17, it says, "Have confidence in your leaders and submit to their authority, because they must keep watch over you as those who must give an account. So do this so that their work will be a joy and not a burden, for that will be of no benefit to you." And what the writer of Hebrews is challenging us to do is to learn how to have confidence in our leaders and to submit to their authority. Why? Because they keep watch over our souls and they have to give an account for what happened to you before God. And so if we walk away without actually clarifying, without actually giving an account, it makes the leader's job very, very difficult. And as a result, not joyful. So I think the writer of Hebrews is right.
And Pastor, in this church, you have a lot of faithful connect group leaders. You know, they really,
We thank God for them.
yeah, they really pour their heart and soul to lead and shepherd their flock.
Yeah.
And sometimes, for whatever reason, CG member may choose to leave because of a conflict. And it can be very discouraging for a connect group leader. In those situations, what would you say to a connect group leader?
Well, let me take this opportunity, first of all, to say to every Connect Group leader, whether you're from FCC or outside, or anyone who does any ministry at all, first of all, we recognize that sometimes leadership really comes at a price. And leaders are those that often will be the last to receive a compliment, but you'll be the first to receive a criticism. And in times like this, we always go back to one thing, that we are doing this not for our own feel-good sake, but we do this because we believe it's a call from God. We do this because we believe that God has called us to shepherd His people, and we're going to do it with all of our heart. And even when we don't always get the response that we want, we never know, what God is doing in the lives of our members. I, for one, have many people who shepherded me when I was growing up, and I'm not always faithful, and I'm not always behave the way I should behave, and oftentimes I have also caused hurt to a lot of my leaders, and walk away, left churches, do all kinds of things, and sometimes badmouth them to other people, and cause a lot of
That's very
pain.
difficult to imagine that you do that.
No, we all have a history and a background, and we all come from that. In fact, when I first became a Christian, there was a good Christian who actually wanted to disciple me, and he would make appointments to see me, and I would always say, okay, I'll come. Then I'll never show up. and the funny thing was, one day I ended up preaching in his church. Years down the road, I was invited to preach in the church, and he came out to me and said, my goodness, imagine what God can do, And so I'm the guy who was running away from him, and now he's sitting there and learning and listening to me, and he was so really moved, and he was so grateful that sometimes we invest and we don't see the return. But it's okay, because you don't know, some of the dividend come way down the road. So let's continue to be faithful in what God has called us to do. Amen. So once again, thank you, all of you who are shepherding God's people.
Okay, another question that I find it really good is, what if both parties find peace in total avoidance?
Oh, well.
Because we encourage them to, engage.
Yeah. Right? I actually want to encourage us not to take the tortoise approach, and just avoid all conflict like the bubonic plague, Now, I think it's good to conflict-proof ourselves, so that we're not trying to court conflicts, but the thing is, when conflicts actually happen, then don't run away from it, because there could be a redemptive side to conflicts, because conflicts can actually help all of us to grow. And so I want to encourage people not to avoid it, not to ghost one another, so to speak, but we learn how to actually have conversation. It's not to go and fight, but it's have conversations with one another. Make it a point to just talk and share what you are feeling, not judgment, but share what you are feeling, so that we can resolve it in early stages of conflict. Stage 1, stage 2 at most. Have those conversations so that we can clear the air, always. And then you will conflict-proof our organization in our churches.
Yeah, so the next question, which I think is also related, because we want to encourage people to engage.
Sure.
So this question is really good. So should both parties, or should they keep trying to resolve things if each confrontation or conversation creates a very emotional and bitter response? That means you fight, keep fighting.
I think by the time a conflict situation show those kind of signs where you are actually fighting, or your voices are raised, your emotions are running high, you have actually gone past stage 2, stage 2, and you have actually gone into stage 3 and maybe even stage 4 already. And in moments like that, I would really encourage mediation, because mediation really helps us to see perspective, and it allows a good mediator can really curate an environment in which both parties have an equal opportunity to actually share their heart, and to be able to have the wisdom of a mediator to know how to give perspective to everything that you are sharing. So I would want to encourage everyone who reach this stage, okay, where the conflict is already showing this kind of signs, it is time for mediation. And don't wait anymore. Go talk to someone that you can trust, a spiritual authority in your life. And if you're in a workplace situation, then escalate it to the next level, where supervisors can come in and really play that role of mediation. Please go for that.
This question was last week's top voted question,
Okay.
and I think it is a very good question that we should ask. How do you manage a conflict biblically when your family mocks you and talk bad about you and your faith?
First of all, I want to thank you for that question, because I think I can, if you are someone that's going through this, I actually fully understand it's a very, very difficult situation for you. I understand because I grew up also in a non-Christian family for many, many years. I went through very similar circumstances that you mentioned. And if you use the SPO model, then we would think spiritually before we think personally and or organizationally. And you will recall, therefore, if you think spiritually about that situation, you will recall Matthew 5:10, where Jesus actually said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And personally, you want to be sure that what they say about you is really false and not true, okay? Because Jesus qualified that by saying, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you." Because if those criticisms are justified and they are caught for, then I think we are losing our witness. So be sure that they are really falsely, you are falsely accused. Then in all these situations, we seek to do what is right, and we always respond in the right spirit. Maintain your witness, and then trust God to vindicate you in His time. I became a Christian when I was 17, and my parents only came to the Lord when they are in their 70s. So we go through a long period where these things can happen. So thinking SPO, I think, spiritually, personally, then organizationally or situationally, if we think that way, then all things are possible. So I want to encourage you. I know it's not an easy situation to go through that kind of mockery and that kind of scorn that you get from family members especially, but let's at all times make sure that we respond correctly and that we keep a good spirit about the whole thing. And take joy in the fact that God actually say you are blessed. Happy are you.
So in a lot of conflict situations, we do want to work towards an outcome. So a good question is it necessary to have a closure in a conflict?
Is it necessary to have closure in a conflict? Now, let me just put it this way. There is a saying that we use in conflict management, which is this: we can disagree, but we must never disengage. We can disagree, but we must never disengage. There has been conflicts that never really found closure, and that's because parties have actually chosen to disengage. So they have disagreed, and because they refuse to engage, and they in fact disengage, it usually resulted in a broken relationship that never heals. And there will be a wound that is left behind. Because we never found closure, there's a wound that's left behind, even though we don't talk about it. It's a little bit like someone took a nail and then they hammer it into your heart, you know. Or we hammer nails into each other's heart. We already disagree like mad. And then after that, we pull out the nail and we walk away. Now that, even though the nail you take and you walk away, the hole remains. And that wound inside sometimes never gets healed. Now, even though it is a choice not to relate anymore, but you can actually choose at the end of the closure not to work together anymore. You can choose to actually not to relate anymore, but at least we bring closure to it by having that conversation, to at least forgive one another, and then we can choose not to work together again. But at least keep the relationship, and you can choose not to work together again. I think there is a place for that. But at least we don't walk away with holes still in our heart. Because sometimes for the greater good of the organization or for all the parties involved, it's better that they choose not to work together. But they keep the relationship and they heal up the wounds so that they can actually move on. So I think that in itself is closure of some sort. But we should always aim for closure. So we can disagree, but we cannot disengage. Yeah.
I think that's a really practical and wise advice. A question I have is, and this is with reference to how you explain vicarious anger.
Okay.
So obviously, I think people are very aware that they should not spread vicarious anger. But I also recognize that often people need to articulate the pains in their hearts. So how can they do that without creating a negative atmosphere? Because it can be a very necessary part of a healing process.
Yes. I do agree that there are times when we do need to really express what is in our hearts, or else we actually could get so bottled up, it could explode inside of you. The only thing I would say is that be careful who we actually share it with. I think the principles are this. Always remember that if, let's say, you are feeling some really bad feelings inside towards leadership or towards something or towards someone, always remember the principles are this. Number one is this. Feedback must always flow upwards. Information will always go downwards. And praise will go all around. Okay, so that's the basic principle. Feedback, especially negative feedback, should always flow upwards. Information should always flow downwards. And praise and compliment should go all around. Now, what we mean by is this, that if I have something negative, if I have some negative feelings, it should always go to people that are either my spiritual authority, they are mentors in my life, they are my trusted kindred spirits, people that I know can actually address that situation and can actually speak into that situation in my life. I think it's important that that negative feedback actually go upwards and not downwards. If it goes downwards, then we are spreading vicarious anger to people that don't know how to manage it. So negative feedback goes upwards. But information that we have that is meant for the people, we should always go downwards, because sometimes leaders are bottleneck. We didn't tell the people, and then information get bottleneck. But if there's a compliment, if there is a good thing, there's praise, I think it should go all around. So we broadcast this thing. So number one is this, let it go to people that can make a difference, and not just anybody that you want to vent your frustration. Number two is this, if you're going to share with somebody, make sure that somebody has the ability to keep confidentiality. Because often we share with the wrong people, and before you know it, it spreads all over the place. So watch out for that. Number three, when you do share with the people that could speak into your life, the people that's able to address situations for you, make sure that you are sharing your feelings and not your judgment. Because that person that hears must also have the wisdom to know that they cannot be binary. they need to think grey because they haven't heard the other side of the story. So look for people of wisdom, and most of the time they would be your mentors, they would be your leaders. So let the feedback go upwards. People can keep confidentiality, have the wisdom to know how to curate this information. Okay, but most importantly, make sure you talk to God because He is the ultimate wisdom. So talk to God. So those are some principles I would hold if you do need to share with someone.
In your teaching, you encourage us to engage promptly, to have a meaningful conversation as soon as we can. And I find this question very meaningful. It says, how do we manage conflict when both parties are quite emotional? Should we wait till we are calmer before talking?
That's a really good question as well. I do believe that there is a timing and a wisdom involved in conflict resolution. And I would definitely agree that it is good, I think, to allow all parties to calm down, to have a chance to think before they engage. Okay, so if both parties are emotionally very high and very worked up, I don't think that is a good time to actually engage. So when we are talking about conversation, it means a good conversation that with calmness of spirit. And it is good for the mediator. And by the way, if they already reached this point where they are so emotional about the whole thing, it is probably past stage 2 also. And it's a good point where for mediators to actually call for a calm down time before they bring them together to have that critical conversation. Now, if there is no mediators involved, then I think it's good for the conflicting parties to actually agree, set a time to actually talk after a cooling down period. Now, in a critical conversation, our goal is always remember this. In a critical conversation, in a conflict resolution situation, our goal is always to generate light rather than heat. We want to generate light and understanding and clarity rather than to generate heat and emotions and and anger. So we want to find clarity, not commotion. We want to generate light and not heat. So yes, I think I agree. There is a place where people can calm down first before they actually engage and have that critical conversation.
Yeah, I think also when people's emotions are settled,
Yeah.
sometimes what seems to be big becomes
Yeah,
smaller.
absolutely, absolutely.
And then they think, why did I get angry about that in the first place?
Yeah. In fact, this one of the common things I do when let's say I have a situation, okay, and somebody, and by the way, there's one thing we must never do. Never use emails and text and SMS to solve conflict situation. When you know that a conflict is brewing between you and some people, never use the written form to actually try and resolve. I actually find emails and texts and all that, they are great for information, but they are terrible for clarification. So what happens if you get a nasty email, someone just send you one and, this is typically what I do, if I get a nasty email, I actually find that when I am upset, I think faster, I think clearer, So when I read the email, the first thing I will do is I immediately hammer out a response. Because I find that when I do that, right, I'm thinking very clearly and very sharp, because all my emotions are wound up. And then what I'll do is I hammer everything out, and then I make sure that I send the email to myself. I remove the guy's name and I put in my email and I send it to myself. I find that when I do that, right, I'm one of those that need to talk it out. I need to hammer it out, So once I do that and I know it's on paper, I can sleep over it. Because if I don't, then it keeps brewing inside, and I find that I want to explode. So I hammer everything out, and then I send the email to myself. I'll go to bed. Next morning, when I'm more calm and I'm more, in control, I will read the email again. And oftentimes, I find that that's when I will change all my statement. I will rewrite everything because I have more reason. I'm more reasonable now. I will take responsibility where I need to take responsibility. And I will apologize where I need to apologize. I clarify where I need to clarify. And then I get it all typed out. Then what I'll do next is I print it out. I print it out. Now I got a written statement. I know how to engage this person now. then I'll pick up the phone and ask for a meeting. And that's when I go there with clarity of mind, ready to engage properly and have a calm and collected conversation. So that's typically what I would do, rather than to reply immediately and create even more trouble. And the problem with emails is that after a while, people don't just reply to the sender. We start to CC and BCC, and then lots of other people get dragged into the picture. And that is really, really unhealthy. Yeah. So that's just some thought for you to consider.
Yeah. Another related question, especially as we are really encouraging people to engage in conversation, is this: what if you tried your best to have conversations and reconciliation, but the person just stonewalls you? So you're not avoiding, the person is avoiding you. What are you going to do?
In conflict resolution, it does take two hands to clap. And what I would do if I do have a situation like that, because I cannot control the other party's response, all I can do is I would like then in the attempt I would make to try and get a conversation going, if I keep getting a stonewall thing and I come to this place where I know that person is not responding to me, the last thing I would like to do would be to leave him with one communication, which is that I'm always ready to talk. So anytime you want to talk, please, I'm available. And then I'll leave it there. But I want to keep that door open and to let him know that he can respond to that last communication, that he can actually call, he can actually engage me anytime the person wants. Yeah. So I think that's what I would do, and the best I can do. The rest I can only pray, and perhaps maybe I would ask people who could mediate the situation to play a role in helping to get the other side to respond. But if even that cannot achieve its purpose, then I think I have no option but to let it rest there. There are some things that we have to live with. And to be honest, I think all of us, if we look back in our own life, there are situations and relationships that has not found its closure. And we have to live with some of this. So those are perhaps the brokenness that we all had to carry in our life. Yeah.
You did also talk about mediators.
Yeah.
And I think, some of us may find ourselves in situations where we need to mediate.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the role of a mediator?
I feel like the mediator's role is really to, number one, understand also the conflict management styles of the parties involved, so that we are able to relate to them accordingly. The goal is to be able to get them to really share what is really going on in their hearts, and to listen to what is being said, and then sometimes even a need to rephrase it in such a way that the other party can understand and find greater understanding. And sometimes even the need not just to rephrase, but to reinterpret, some of the things that could be going on in that conflict situation that already got muddled because of the conflict situation. And then in the end, to get both parties not just to talk, but also to listen. And then to be able to summarize and to be able to reinterpret or to reset it in ways that both parties can understand. And then ultimately, I think the mediator's role is to be able to land the whole thing by charting out new agreements, new commitments, and new perspective, so that both parties can then continue. And where there's a need to get parties to seek reconciliation or to seek forgiveness or to render forgiveness, I think the mediator should facilitate that. And then to make sure that the SPO model is being, if it is between two Christians, then I think taking the SPO model to actually make sure that it's being resolved in a biblical manner. Yeah.
As we talk about conflicts management, our hearts really go out to those people who are trapped in conflict situations or are still deeply hurt, wounded by conflicts you have experienced. So as we land tonight's session, I'm going to invite Pastor Benny to pray redemption and restoration into your life and situation. We want to believe with you that God's power and presence are with you. He is working in, through, and around you, working all things together for your good. So, Pastor Benny, can you just pray?
Well, before I pray, can I just leave you with two thoughts to land this whole thing? Firstly, I'd like to read for you Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, verse 16 is where Paul gives us some instructions about love and love being in action. And then he applies it also to conflict situation. And I'd like to read this firstly, Romans chapter 12, verse 16. Live in harmony with one another, Paul says. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position, and do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. And then Paul tells us all these things, and then he ended off verse 18 with this one-liner that is so interesting. He says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. I think the Apostle Paul is such a practical person. He knows that there are situations where it is, very, very difficult, as it were, to live at peace with every single person. And he understands that. And he tells us how to conflict-proof ourselves just by learning to live in harmony with one another, to remove pride and ego from all of this, and be willing to associate with people of all kinds. And then not to be conceited. Don't repay anyone evil for evil, but just be careful to do what is right in the eyes of God. Then even after doing all these things, there could be some people that you find still hard, to relate to. And then he says, if it is possible. In other words, he do recognize that in some situation, it may not be all that possible. But he said, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, as far as it depends on us. Now, if other people don't want to play their part, there's not much we can do. But as much as it depends on us, we want to live at peace with everyone. And that is our mandate. And that is our call. And then, how do we do that? How do we actually, if other people don't want to respond correctly, how do we end up, how do we respond to all that? And here's where Paul wrote another beautiful phrase in Philippians chapter 3. And can I just read this one for you? And this is so powerful. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 15, Paul gave us a principle. And the principle goes like this. All of us then who are mature should take such a view of things. Okay? But if on some point you think differently, that too God will make clear to you. Only let us live up to what we have already attained. Now, this is a very powerful principle when it comes to relationship, because we all know that in some relationships, we could be dealing with people that don't think the same as us. Or they may be lacking in some maturity, etc. And Paul actually said this, all of us then who are mature should take such a view of things. So he's saying that if you are mature, you should see things in a particular way. But if on some point you think differently, if you can't, then he says, that too God will make clear to you. So let God be the one to bring that revelation, to bring that maturity into the other person's life. But your responsibility is this, let us live up to what we have already attained. So the level of your maturity, you need to be responsible to God to live that out. Now, other people may not think the same because they could be at a different level of maturity. And we must, as Chuck Swindoll said, Chuck Swindoll, by the way, wrote a beautiful book. You need to go and get it. It's a book entitled Whatever Happened to Grace. And in his book, right, there is one chapter that is worth its weight in gold. That chapter is a chapter that says the grace to let others be. Okay, and that is so powerful. And this is what Paul is talking about. You find the grace to let others be because they are not at a point of maturity. So we must find a grace to be able to allow them to be where they are, but let God be the one to bring that revelation and bring that maturity. But as far as we are concerned, we do and live up to the level of maturity that God has taken us to. And once we're able to do that, then sometimes we can forgive, we find the grace to be able to forgive. And maybe just off my head now, I have just one more verse I want to read for you. Since we are on it, I might as well go on a roll. So here's a verse that I want to end with, and I'll pray this verse over you. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 12, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Let's learn to bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgives you. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. I think this, if there's one reason why we should forgive, even though others have hurt us, it will be this. We forgive because God has forgiven us. That's reason enough for us to choose to forgive others. So can we pray together? Let's pray together. Thank you, Lord. Father, I thank you that we are your chosen people, holy, dearly loved by you. So tonight, we want to clothe ourselves with compassion. We clothe ourselves with kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Lord, may you, because this is who you are, you enable us to really bear with one another and forgive people that we have grievances against. And even those who have grievances against us, teach us how to choose to forgive. And Lord, thank you that we find that grace to be able to forgive only because you first forgave us. So Lord Jesus, may you impart to us that grace tonight. And there are people here that are hurting because of things that has been done to them, words that has been spoken to them, and they find it so hard to forgive. God, would you grant us that grace that comes from above? So because you first forgave us, teach us how to forgive others also. And God, may you help every one of us, whether in our homes, our churches, our organization, to conflict-proof ourselves so that we know when conflicts arise, we know how to deal with it. And when we understand it's never too early to manage a conflict and it's never too late to engage when we need to. So Lord, may you continue to teach us and help us as we continue on this journey of building houses of peace everywhere we go. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Benny. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you have found tonight's session very helpful and insightful. Do follow us on our Facebook to get updates promptly, and we'll see you next week, same time, where Pastor Benny will be talking about the fear of the Lord. So God bless and have a good night.
God bless you. See you again.